Hello. It's great to be here, and I'm just gonna a quick timekeeping bit of business. A couple of us have flights that we're going to be trying to catch, and so this panel is definitely going to end by 1 p.m. And we're going to all stick to our time and hopefully have some time for questions at the end. So welcome to the panel, Exhibiting Controversy, Promoting Debate. And I want to thank the AAMC and the programming committee for their support in pulling this panel together. They were very engaged in the process of formulating the panel. I'm Kathleen Bickford-Burzak, and I'm the Associate Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Block Museum at Northwestern. Like probably many of you, over my career, I've been fascinated by exhibitions that have gone badly awry. It's the kind of thing that sometimes keeps me awake at night. Primitivism in 20th century art in 1984, Into the Heart of Africa at the Royal Ontario Museum in 1989, which Sylvia Forney is going to be talking a little bit about. The West as America at the National Museum of American Art in 1991. Even the unrealized Enola Gay exhibition that the Air and Space Museum had started in 1995 but never came to fruition. Articles and books have been written about these exhibitions. They're touchstones, they were explosive, and they ignited a lot of debate. And it's a serious issue when we put our work into the public and release it to interpretation and to response. The flip side of that, of course, is institutions and curators intentionally taking on hot button issues and bringing their institutions along in the process of creating an opportunity for using the medium of art and the art exhibition to promote dialogue. And art is, after all, a great mechanism for doing this. Its complexity, its nuance, its openness to interpretation. Art exhibitions are full of potential for bringing people together to engage in dialogue around difficult topics. And that's what we're going to be focusing on this panel. So, oh, that is not my slide. Did my slides get loaded into the deck? Maybe not. So I was going to talk a little bit about some projects that I did, and I'm just going to do that really quickly without images. At the Art Institute of Chicago, I was honored to present an exhibition called Benin, Kings and Rituals, Court Arts from Nigeria in 2008. This was an exhibition that originated at the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna and was curated by Barbara Plankensteiner. The exhibition reunited works that are now held in museums in the UK, Europe, the United States, at the National Commission for Museums and Monuments in Nigeria, and at the Court of Benin, also in Nigeria. The installation addressed head-on the invasion of the Benin Kingdom in 1897 by the British. It looked at the seizure of artworks from royal palaces and the exiling of the Oba, or King of Benin, following the invasion. And it made transparent for visitors the fraught history of Benin's arts. However, equally important was what played out behind the scenes as that exhibition was being planned and the exhibition tour was happening, because it brought together key stakeholders at museums and at the Court of Benin who were, up until that moment, at best, on very wary terms. This led to conversations about the future of the Benin corpus and access to it. And these conversations are still ongoing to this day. So in my opinion, this was one of the most important legacies of this project, this ongoing opportunity for dialogue across institutions and individuals. In 2015, my current institution, the Block Museum, presented an exhibition called Collecting Paradise, the Buddhist Art of Kashmir and Its Legacies. And this exhibition foregrounded challenging questions for visitors to contemplate through graphics and installation techniques. And you would see some of those examples if I had my slides, so I apologize. The first work of art in the exhibition actually placed the object with its back towards the viewers, and it exposed an open hole in the sculpture that housed materials that were the things that sacralized this object as a ritual object. The graphic above read, "What does it mean to display ritual objects? What does it mean to display objects from another culture, place, and time in a Western museum? And what's lost and what's gained when objects are collected across cultures?" Other groupings in the exhibition suggested the changed contexts of objects and also the separations that have been created by collecting. So obviously these aren't new display strategies, but they're really impactful methods for inviting visitors to actively participate in critical thinking around important issues. This panel was conceived to hear from curators who've created exhibitions that engage with big questions of our day. What are their experiences? What strategies have they used for working with peers, stakeholders, and the public, inside and outside of their institutions? And what pitfalls might they have encountered on the way? I want to warmly thank our participants for their openness in sharing their experiences and insights with us. And they are, in the order of presentation, Sylvia Forney, who is the Curator of African Arts and Culture at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto; Ra Kushka, Chief Curator and Curator of Contemporary Art at the Tacoma Museum of Art; Graham Betcher, Deputy Director, and William and Carrie Hulsey, Curator of American Art at the Birmingham Museum of Art; Kelly Morgan, who is a doctoral candidate in African American Studies at UMass Amherst; and finally, Heather Igloolioti, who is the Research Chair in Indigenous Art History and Community Engagement at Concordia University in Montreal. You can learn more about their amazing careers in your program. Each speaker is going to spend 15 minutes making their presentations, and Graham and Kelly are going to be presenting together. And this will be followed hopefully by some Q&A with all of you. So Sylvia.
Hello, everybody. I'm not sure if it's morning or afternoon. Thank you, Kathleen. So, without further ado, if I can get this to move. Okay. My presentation today is a reflection on a troubled exhibitionary history involving African objects, images, and communities. An attempt to start to make sense of the complicated intellectual, relational, and affective issues that have informed my thinking and practice as a curator in the last 8 years, and some of the recent developments that are slowly but hopefully changing the landscape of how a mainstream museum with a complicated history may work towards regaining the trust of its community. Since 2008, I have been the curator of the African collection at the Royal Ontario Museum, or ROM, in Toronto. I work in a large natural history and world cultures museum in a setting that may be known to some of you because of its role in shaping the practice on the poetic and politics of museum displays. Africa at the ROM is a paradigmatic example when referred to in a number of essays from a variety of disciplinary perspectives. Africa at the ROM is not famous because of the exceptional quality of the material in its collection, but because of the controversy surrounding the 1989 exhibition Into the Heart of Africa, one of the oft-quoted museological debacles of the late 20th century. I do not have time here to give justice to the complex layering of intellectual and political agendas, social tensions, and power struggles that unfolded on the steps and in the galleries of the ROM 25 years ago. In a nutshell, though, I can say that what was intended to be a self-reflexive and critical exhibition on the origin of museum collections from Africa became yet another instance of the colonial oppressions towards an African-Canadian community. Inspired by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's warning against the danger of a single story, we had to work creatively to ensure that each program and event, spread over 3 years, at times with significant gaps, would not just stand on its own, but become a part of a larger picture. For this, we created an Of Africa website as a virtual archive of many of our public initiatives. I'm off with my slide. Oh, okay, anyway. A witness to new initiatives and dialogues, but also at times of lingering tensions. These came out very explicitly during a large symposium entitled Histories, Collections, and Reflection that we organized in 2014. This symposium was preceded by a private event entitled Acknowledging the Past, Forging the Future, directed to members of the African-Canadian community, many of whom have not set foot at the ROM since 1989. At this event, management and former activists met for the first time inside the museum to commemorate what happened 25 years ago. During this event, the talks highlighted the specific political and social tensions that crystallize around that fateful exhibition and the continued erasure of Blackness from Canadian historical narratives. While libations and drumming did not magically resolve the long-standing tensions between the ROM and the community, the acknowledgement event did put the museum in the position to actually discuss the issues directly with the people involved. One of the outcomes of this long discussion is actually a statement that will be presented publicly and jointly later this year as a point of departure for the final year of the program. Indeed, the issues brought to the fore in the messy context zone created through the acknowledgement event and the symposium that followed were very clearly about political rights and inclusion of people of African descent in the master narrative of the Canadian nation, and the public presentation of one of its largest museum institutions. At the same time, the material premises of this inclusion referred not so much to the specificity of an Afro-Canadian identity, but to the indisputable rootedness of Black identity in things African. In a powerful essay published in 1991 in Third Text, Canadian author and poet Norbese Phillips presented a lucid critique of the communicative impasse at the core of the conflict between the ROM and the protesters. At the core of this impasse was the contrast between the loud and clear statements of the photos and the words of the missionaries who had collected the objects during their civilizing missions, and the muteness and opacity of the artwork, which were intended to highlight the complexity and creativity of African cultures. I'm a firm believer in the captivating power of objects. Objects are powerful extensions of the agency of their makers and users, as Alfred Gell has taught us. Yet once removed from their context of production and use and recontextualized in a museum, their original meaning often becomes less readable than the history of structural inequality that is at the basis of their displacement. The resignification of the material and creative meanings of displaced objects require then a careful work of recreation of some form of affective and relational experience. This, according to Norbese Philip, was one of the biggest problems of the ROM into the Heart of Africa, the silence of the objects in a museum of silence. In the last 2 years, I've been working very hard to move beyond this silence, whether it relates to specific events of African history, like, for example, a small display commemorating 130 years of the Berlin Conference, or complex diasporic trajectories that shape multiple African-Canadian identities. One of the exhibition highlights of our program so far has been a powerful installation by a young African-Canadian artist positioned in the central exhibition space of the very Victorian Sigmund Samuel Gallery of Canada. Worn, shaping Black feminine identity, displayed a single work by Karen Jones, a Victorian morning dress covered with braided hair extensions surrounded by cotton balls and the artist's own hair. A piece that referred to the complex history connecting slavery, the Industrial Revolution, and the economic power of the British Empire, while at the same time suggesting much more personal and intimate reflections on female body, Blackness, and the constricting parameters of Canadian whiteness. One of the clear messages of Into the Heart of Africa controversy was the relevance of objects and presence and emotional connections that people of African descent feel vis-a-vis artifacts and artworks that embodied an important dimension of identity and sense of multiple dislocations. By acknowledging this connection, of Africa continues to build a renewed sense of engagement and possibility that it's grounded in, but not weighed by, the lessons learned from Into the Heart of Africa. Thank you.
Good afternoon, I think. Thank you, Kathleen, for inviting me to participate and to aid. I'm sorry, I'm very soft-spoken. I don't know how to use these things. I also like to thank Kathleen one more time for inviting me, and for AAMC to allow me to share Tacoma Art Museum's story in real time. This is an ongoing situation. I also want to take a moment to thank a lot of people in the audience who helped make Art AIDS America happen. So many institutional loans, so many calls for advice, and so much encouragement, particularly MFAH's own Allison Green, who's my secret mentor. So originally, I was invited to present about Tacoma Art Museum's process of engaging board, staff, volunteers, and museum supporters around an exhibition that we knew was going to be contentious because of its subject matter: death, disease, sexuality, and political protest, all on the top of every curator's list to do. Instead, I have the opportunity to present a case study of a recent protest and my museum's response. The Tacoma Action Collective brought to our attention the lack of Black representation in this exhibition, and a reminder of the impact of HIV on African American communities. We were caught slightly flat-footed by this switch between a museum exhibition and issues of social justice. And as we learned yesterday from Hilton Ells and Darren Walker, the scales really got tipped at Tacoma Art Museum, and we're trying to bring them back into balance. My co-curator, Dr. Jonathan Katz from the University of Buffalo, envisioned Art AIDS America as a project that would return AIDS to the centrality of discourses around American contemporary art, and make people aware that the AIDS crisis remains the great repressed motor of American creativity, in Dr. Katz's language. And he wanted to remind everyone that the artist's response to AIDS was not a tragic tangent to the development of American art, but at the very core of the last 30 years of American production. Similarly, I sought to emphasize the precedents that made this work possible: feminism and earlier generations of art about identity, Chicano art, African American art, Native American art. And what I hoped that this exhibition would remind everyone is that the radicalness of the art of the 80s and 90s still remains at the core of American artistic practice. Framing about AIDS has always been key. It's always demanded very specific language, whether it's medical, social, political, artistic, and ultimately personal issues. And the exhibition Art Aids America, the core is always, very core of the exhibition is about protest, but on two distinct sides of a spectrum. You have the agitprop on one side, the ACT UP and Grand Fury, the New York school, if you will. And on the other coast, in the exact same year, quiet, collaborative, and a mourning kind of gesture, the Names Project, that comes from the tradition of the American quilting bee. And as an editorial aside, I would like to remind you all to never underestimate the subversive power of needles and thread. But this slide brings to mind the recent words of my director, Stephanie Stevish. If you present an exhibition about protest, you probably should be prepared for one of your own. And given that we are in a generation of protest, as a gay man of a certain age, I found it a little bit unsettling to be on the other side of the equation. But I also was prepared with some empathy for what the protesters were asking, as I felt excluded when I presented my graduate thesis to the University of Wisconsin on AIDS activist art. I was told that this wasn't art and it had no business in an art history department, but I did it anyway. And I also took great solace after about a day of wondering what I did wrong when I realized that the Tacoma Action Collective took a page out of the ACT UP Grand Fury playbook and gave us the kind of protests that were happening in the 80s and 90s, for which I am extraordinarily pleased that they did this. But I want to, for those of you who haven't seen the exhibition in its various manifestations to date, I want to sort of remind everyone that this art is at the very heart contentious. And in fact, Jonathan Katz's term poetic postmodernism speaks to the way that these artists sought to collapse a mainstream art making based around teachings of the Academy around Roland Barthes' Death of the Artist. And this art tried to answer very directly what you do when artists begin to die by the thousands. This art was personal, and it was no longer appropriate to do something that was anti-authorial. The art functioned as an irritant. It was meant to be difficult, uncomfortable, and disruptive. But the context is also important because artists tried to evade political prohibitions and market-based strictures against art that overtly mentioned AIDS. But yet, in the case of artists like Felix Gonzalez Torres, it's impossible to think of their art without connecting it to the friends that they had lost, the lover who had died, or their engagement with ACT UP. Importantly, what an artist like Gonzalez Torres was able to do is reinsert the primacy of the object and the artist back into the museum. And this continues today in any number of works. And this knowledge, this practice was transferred colleague to colleague, as in the case of Gonzalez Torres, to Hodges, generation to generation. This art is now being taught in graduate schools, and it's being celebrated by major museums. And just as a reminder, that artists Deb Cass, Donald Moffat, Robert Gober, and Jim Hodges have all had major recent survey exhibitions. And this art helps us find beauty through loss and pain, and it helps us connect to our humanity and celebrate all of the things that we've shared. On December 17th, a group of about 24 protesters staged a die-in in our galleries and lobby to give voice to the erasure of Black bodies in the exhibition. In their estimation, attention to the exhibition did not give enough attention to representation by African American artists and did not represent the present-day impact of HIV on their communities, particularly trans women. Other demands focused on much larger and broader social justice goals. For those of you who know Dr. Katz, you know that he would be rather cross with me if I didn't relay his scholarly analysis that Art AIDS America is significantly diverse in age, geography, ethnicity, sexuality, and career stage or representation. However, the primary critique of the Tacoma Action Collective was that the exhibition did not represent my story or my relationship to HIV/AIDS. The artist selection should have represented the fact that 44% of all new instances of HIV in the United States are in African Americans. So the question for me is how, as a curator, would I even begin to attempt a task of this scope? I mean, how do we build complex and compelling stories while attempting some semblance of control over budgets and logistics? How do we underscore the range of artistic possibility, such as collaboration, without diffusing or obscuring intensity of each other's experience? You know, the protesters did rightfully call out the disproportionate impact of HIV on African American communities and issues of structural racism in the museum industry and the art market. At Tacoma Art Museum, with an acquisitions budget of exactly $0, I felt somewhat helpless to even begin to attempt to answer those questions during the heat of the protests. But within 48 hours, Tacoma Art Museum met with leaders in the African American community, and we had a first meeting with the Tacoma Action Collective. We issued a statement for the exhibition acknowledging the critique and the various social, political, and economic factors exacerbating the ongoing epidemic, including mass incarceration and lack of access to affordable medical care, educational opportunities, and affordable housing. We commissioned the artist and activist Sir Rodney Sir to write a thought piece on the situation. We agreed to redouble our efforts for organizational development and increase our transparency on what we were doing to address some of these structural issues. And we also issued a joint press release with the Action Collective in which they proclaimed, quote, "We are grateful for the time and effort that the Tacoma Art Museum has dedicated to our community, and we are proud that they are setting an example for museums nationwide," end quote. I'm not sure if that's true, but we can hope. Our ongoing work with this issue includes the entire senior management team attending the People's Institute's Undoing Institutional Racism workshop. Our recent board retreat was on diversity and equity, and we have upcoming staff trainings over the course of the next couple of years about these issues. And what we need to do is show our community the extent that we're dedicating resources to address structural racism in our museum. The third demand from the Tacoma Action Collective was that we add additional works by Black artists into the exhibition. There were 3 weeks left at Tacoma Art Museum, so that was probably not going to happen just purely from a logistical standpoint. But I also reminded the group that I've never envisioned that the Art AIDS America exhibition was the final authoritative history of HIV and art. And also, I also wanted to be very keen that just adding artists would not be a sufficient way, because I was uncomfortable with making these 3 issues go away quietly. My expectation is that each additional venue would add artists from their permanent collection or through conversations with their community and ask the questions, what does the community need and what is possible given the constraints of each of the venues. And despite the protestations of my co-curator, we are encouraging the critique to be brought forward, and we're exhibiting our joint statement about the critique in the issue. But there are 2 additional issues that we have not fully unpacked at our museum. One is the appropriation of works of one person of color by another group without permission. Our exhibition logo was designed by an Asian American woman, And she confronted the members of the Action Collective and asked why they didn't ask her about her experience. And this sort of began a really important conversation, individual to individual, that remains ongoing. But also, how can our museum continue to deepen these conversations and awareness about identities? And I'm showing this image by Deb Cass still here because at Jonathan Katz's opening lecture, he had finished his overview of the show. He was standing in front of this slide, and a lesbian woman asked, "Where are the images by lesbians in the show?" And of course, we couldn't tell her that this is actually by a militant lesbian with a radical agenda. But Jonathan did what an art historian, professorial type will do, and noodled her around to a very nuanced and very high-level understanding. But that also raises the questions for me is what is an appropriate response from a museum curator when activists insist that collaboratives that include African Americans do not count as their representation? How do I respond? And what are the curatorial ethics regarding work with incendiary material like this, or topics that the artists themselves often navigate only in private? So in conclusion, I want to share three personal observations. One is that I had, during this process over the past few months, I've had to recommit to my belief that art can affect positive change. It's something that I absorbed as a student, and I had to recommit to that vision. And secondly, that change or disruption is uncomfortable and sometimes can be difficult, but it's necessary. And people won't protest your museum unless they care deeply. And if you don't sit down and talk with them, you're missing an extraordinary opportunity. And thirdly and finally, there's a need for additional work on projects about HIV in the United States and in particular in communities of color. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Graham Betcher, Deputy Director and Curator of American Art at the Birmingham Museum of Art.
And I'm Kelly Morgan. I won't go through the title at the same time.
We were the co-curators of an exhibition entitled Black Like Who, Exploring Race and Representation, which opened at the Birmingham Museum of Art on July 11th of last year and closed that fall. I'm going to start off giving a little preamble to the exhibition, telling you a little bit about its background. It was a long time in the making, and Kelly is going to take us further into the themes, and she's our closer. The exhibition, some of you, especially those of you from Canada, will recognize that the title was cribbed wholesale from Ronaldo Walcott's groundbreaking 1997 study of Black culture in Canada. And it, of course, is also a reference to Langston Hughes' poem, Dream Variations, the final line, Black Like Me. The point of the exhibition was to ask really two questions. Who renders imagery of Blackness, and why? Through the exhibition, we sought to explore how various representations of Blacks in American art have been influenced at particular historical moments by specific political, cultural, and aesthetic interests, as well as the motives and beliefs of the artists. And we were very intentional in including representations of Black bodies by both Black and white artists in the exhibition. Now, because the exhibition was drawn primarily from the permanent collection, with some select loans from prominent collections within the Birmingham community, there were very few early I mean, from the 19th or early 20th century, representations of Blacks by Black artists. By the time we got to the middle of the 20th century and well into contemporary artistic practice, that changed radically. And just one note, some of you are interested in how do we come up with title walls for exhibitions. Our creative director, James Williams, used as an inspiration for the title wall applications in which the applicant is asked to fill in the circle and identify his or her race. A little bit of background about the Birmingham Museum of Art. It was founded in 1951, and until 1964, blacks were only allowed to visit the museum on Tuesdays, what was called Negro Day. And David Driscoll came to the museum several years ago and spoke very powerfully about being turned away at the door of the Birmingham Museum of Art when he tried to bring a group of students on a day that was not Negro Day. And that was something that stayed with him, and really felt that being on the stage at that museum years later, accepting an award for his scholarship and impact on the museum field and on the art world was really coming full circle in a way. The exhibition was a long time in the making. I actually checked my email this morning. I never delete anything, much to the dismay of our IT director. I've got thousands and thousands of emails archived, and I found a loan request that I sent out in 2010, in August of 2010. So I started working on this show way back then, long before my collaborator and co-curator Kelly Morgan arrived at the Birmingham Museum of Art as a curatorial fellow in African American art. I like to think that I did exactly what Jen Mergel invited us and encouraged us to do, which was invite a different perspective. The reason the show didn't open shortly after it was conceived, because it's a small show in a small gallery, and to be perfectly honest with you, it was originally conceived because we had a gap in the calendar. There was a space. We didn't want to leave a prominent gallery open for a long time. It's typically a gallery in which we've shown the work of African American artists, and it was too prominently situated to leave it fallow for too long. And so I came up with a working checklist, and then a number of things changed. We had our schedule turned out to be then overloaded. Our prep staff and registrars asked the curators to perhaps consider lightening the load a little bit. This may be a common theme at some of your institutions, and we did exactly that. I then saw, once it was clear that Kelly was about to arrive, initially I thought, here's an opportunity to give an emerging scholar in art history in the museum realm a really meaty project. And I made it. I said, would you be willing to work on this exhibition with me? I think I had to ask. Initially, the answer was yes, but then what I had to make clear was the fact that I wasn't asking Kelly to accept the checklist that I had already put together. I was asking her to be a true collaborator, and everything was on the table. Everything was up for discussion. And so what it turned into was a true partnership. I come from a very strong art historical background. I trained at Yale, where they always say, we call it the history of art department, because first and foremost, you're historians. And so I'm rather steeped in that perspective, and also come from a material culture background. Kelly comes from a cultural studies background, and that different perspective proved to be so important in putting together this exhibition, far more important than we anticipated, because as we were in the process of firming up our checklist and getting the show on the road, so to speak, America changed irreversibly. The cultural and social and racial climate in this country changed due to a number of events: Michael Brown, Freddie Carlos Gray, Eric Garner. And so this is the climate that we then had to respond to. I only, thank my lucky stars, or thank God that there was the time to respond before the show opened, and that I had an extremely knowledgeable and capable and very creative and responsive co-curator. I remember one conversation in which I was up in New York at the opening of the Winter Antique Show. I was running late for the opening, and Kelly called and she said, I've got to talk to you now. And I said, well, okay, all right. And it turned into an hour-long conversation. I arrived at the opening very late, but it was a valuable conversation but because it was a conversation in which she laid out what she saw as a new concept for the exhibition, which was really paring down the checklist, allowing for kind of bite-sized morsels, thematic sections for the exhibition, and breaking down what was a larger checklist into kind of bite-sized morsels that were more interesting and more digestible and allowed us to explore in greater depth the material that we were presenting, far more than we could do with just a didactic label. So the exhibition itself included, I think, about, in the final analysis, 35 works, and I'll just take you through some of the themes. We started with the section Old Times There Are Not Forgotten, the Black Image in the South and Beyond. This included the work of exclusively white artists because, like I said, we were drawing from our permanent collection, and these were the earliest works in our collection, which includes a number of black figures. This is a work by Gilbert Gall on the right and The Study on the left, and you will forgive the distortion on this screen. We tried to dispel the myth of the loyal black slave, which was one of the most touted, still is one of the most touted myths of fans of the Confederacy. Gilbert Gall, who was a northern artist who moved south to Tennessee and pandered to a southern audience, used to advertise these works in Confederate Veteran magazine. Suffice it to say that magazine is no longer in publication. We also included works from the landmark 1935 anti-lynching exhibition organized by Walter White of the NAACP. I've been consciously collecting these works for the Birmingham Museum of Art for the last few years. So John Curry's Fugitive on the right and The Study on the left. And then Black Like Me, African American Portraits. Most notably, the first portrait of Dr. Carver, painted from life by a Birmingham artist back in 1937, and a work by George Biddle, Frankie Loper, a lithograph, based on a painting in the Colorado Springs Fine Arts Center's collection. And Frankie Loper was the former slave of Jefferson Davis. And then works by local artists as well. Betty Grisham, Alabama-born artist who worked in Atlanta.
Thank you. So I'm going to kind of explain to you all about how I got to that phone call and then pick up with the last two sections of the exhibition. And so when I arrived at BMA, it was this real type of tenor of like, what is she going to do? And, how is she going to respond to this show? Because the staff was familiar with the odor checklist. And no one had said anything at first, but it's like the closer we got, it was like, hey, what do you think, about the checklist? Should we do this show? Because there's this really fraught history, between the African American community and the BMA. Another thing that happened is I launched a lecture series where I was really discussing with the community, and I called it Community Conversations. So we come in, we discuss difficult imagery, and based on works in the permanent collection by artists of African descent. And one of these days, Graham had a minstrel advertisement like hanging in one of our hallways. And it was actually a photograph. Walker Evans, yeah. And there was this sort of melee between a younger white couple and two African American women about why would the museum show something like this, the insensitivity and putting that up. And I was coming down the hallway, getting ready to pick up lunch from the cafe. And sort of diffuse, this sort of argument that was taking place. There was murmuring with our security staff, which is primarily African American, about just kind of this anxiety, about us doing this show. And when I first encountered the checklist, even myself, I said, okay, Kelly, thinking about curating from the community first, right? When African Americans see minstrel imagery or very difficult imagery, it's a very physical response, right, that we have. It's a very emotional response that these images sort of trigger. And so in sort of working through that in my own head, and I said, I can't kind of let this happen in this way, I called Graham immediately. So we had this hour-long conversation. And I worked through the checklist again and said, well, we really have these really cool 5 sections, that we can work through to really talk about how Blackness is constructed. When we talk about race in this country, majority of the time, it's through a lens of Blackness. But Blackness it changes, right? For different historical periods. And the way that the checklist was laid out at that particular moment, I could really see, right, the very specific places where Blackness has always been constructed, or sort of moments of construction. So this portraiture, advertising, right, Black femininity. And so we sort of pared it down. And I really wanted to look at I really wanted to sort of get our audiences to look past what they expected to see. So there was this idea of like, oh, it's going to be racist imagery. Birmingham has always been irresponsible with how it's handled issues of race or issues of representation. And I wanted a type of interpretive script that would allow not only Black viewers, right, to see past the racist imagery, but even white viewers that would come in and have an issue with the museum doing a show about Blackness. And so that was basically how we got to the sections. So this particular section grew directly out of my dissertation, which really centers Black feminine identity to the modern narrative, right? So this idea of Black feminine subjectivity and how it is really central to European modernism as well as American modernism. And so I started with this particular image was really important. Frank Hartley Anderson was an Alabama artist, really well known for his sympathetic portrayals of African American community and Black culture. And so my label for this really pushed or attempted to sort of push viewers past the mammy image and understanding the laundress as an extension of the mammy image, pushing them past that understanding to really show how African American women show up in American visual culture as this representation of American labor. Hartley was really instrumental and concerned about Alabama steelworkers. And so putting this image in conversation with his other works to get viewers to kind of push past, again, this mammy image or sort of Black women sort of slaving away, at industrial works. This one was really important to me because Catlett is really my muse. My introduction into curatorial work, or even just wanting to pursue a curatorial career, came through my first introduction, to her sculpture. This is a portrait that we don't, or a print, that we don't see often when we think about Catlett's, particularly her print work. And because of the socio-political moment in Black Lives Matter, it was really important to include this one because I wanted viewers to understand that police brutality was not something that was new to the contemporary moment, particularly Black women speaking out about police brutality, because the leaders of the Black Lives Matter moment are 3 Black women. Catlett, produced this print at a very specific time, early 70s, late 60s. A lot of the rebellions, which are primarily referenced as race riots that were occurring in different urban cities, were occurring as the community sort of responding to police brutality. And then there's a very interesting, this was the print that got us the only really negative comment in the book from a police family.
They said that they would no longer support the museum because of the exhibition, that they were a police family and they wouldn't support the museum because of the exhibition in solidarity with Ferguson. Yeah.
And so, it's whatever. Okay. This one was a gem that I sort of found just kind of putzing around in storage, that I was over the moon about, because it's a Benin, and he's really known more for his sculpture, and it really centers the Black female figure in this conversation about modernism, showing her as a new woman and this sort of central figure, right, to modern aesthetics. This is the third section was rhythmic representation. So it really deals with conceptions of Blackness in music. Went Out Rice, who's a very, well-known Harlem Renaissance artist, and his sort of like default acceptance into the, or as sort of like a representer of Blackness at that moment. But what was really interesting about this particular print, which Graham actually donated or gifted to the collection, was his usage, if you look really closely, of like Sambo or sort of minstrel imagery. The red lips, really, really black faces. And so really trying to sort of trouble this idea of just because it was a Harlem Renaissance representation, that it was a positive representation. Why were his intentions not, questioned or troubled in the same kind of ways that other artists who were rendering African-American, cultural African-American Blackness at the time really were? This brown print was a really important one too, to really talk about like contemporary culture, how African-American artists are using hip-hop, brown in particular, right, to sort of remix traditional art history in Brown's career. She's really known for like this remixing of Japanese prints and this sort of remixing of gender as well. So if you look at the figure, like you can't really tell if it's a little boy or a little girl, but there are hints in color that will kind of bring you to sort of your own interpretation of what this figure means. Our last section was from Mammy to Mose, and it was advertising in the Black image. And so advertising is how we really come to understand Blackness, throughout American history. And we put these two images together for obvious reasons. And I really wanted to get at the fact that like events or sort of practices that we have in an everyday, or sort of everyday American practices are kind of inherently steeped, right, in this problematic sort of racist narrative. So how the pancake breakfast has these really problematic ties to racist advertising. And then the last one was Sheila P. Wright's work on African-American beauty, or Black women's beauty standards. And so again, sort of troubling this idea of beauty ideals. And so these were actually outside, so these were the first images that visitors interpreted or interacted with before they walked into the gallery. And so I'll end here because this is kind of, this is the last slide, but this is also where we kind of left off in terms of like our contemporary time period. And so thank you for listening to me babble on, because I went way over my time.
Oh, there's all kinds of waters under the podium. I didn't know. It's just a hidden stash. Hi, my name is Heather Igloolioti. I am Inuit from the Nunatsiavut territory of Labrador. That is, I don't have a map, but it's basically opposite Alaska. I have an 11-year curatorial practice, and I've been a professor at Concordia University. Is mine next? Yeah. I've been a professor at Concordia University in Montreal since getting my PhD in 2013, where I also hold a research chair. I've been invited to reflect on an exhibit that I curated in 2010 that launched in 2011 at the Ottawa Art Gallery called Decolonize Me. It toured to 8 locations across Canada up until late 2015. As the first site of the exhibition, the Ottawa Art Gallery was a particularly poignant place for the exploration of decolonial exhibition practice, because the Ottawa Art Gallery, which is seen here, along with the other arts organizations that are housed in this complex called the Arts Court, is in fact residing in a former discursive space of colonial rule, a former courthouse, a jail. So the whole Ottawa Art Gallery is based inside of this very colonial institution. What better place than this historical property to explore the experimental mobilization of Indigenous and decolonial strategies in the exhibition of contemporary Aboriginal art in Canadian museums and other institutions? In my mind, Decolonize Me is a part of an expanding, ongoing project to engage Canadians in the timely and critically needed conversation about our shared, long, and complicated history of colonization, to participate in the emergent processes of decolonization and the concomitant assertion of Indigenous sovereignty and cultural continuity within our borders and beyond. The curatorial premise behind Decolonize Me stemmed in part from my previous experiences as a curator of an exhibition in 2008. It was my first major touring exhibition called We Were So Far Away, The Inuit Experience of Residential Schools, and it featured the oral histories of 8 living Inuit residential school survivors, including personal photographs. This is one of the survivors. Right here, third from the back, Peter Ernick, who supplied his own image, and then also archival imagery, which was used to elaborate upon their personal histories. The exhibition featured the oral histories of 8 survivors across Canada. That's 2 from each of the Inuit regions of northern Canada who endured horrible abuses as children, physical, sexual, psychological, and experiencing the lasting colonial legacies of that trauma as adults. In America, you have a similar history of boarding schools. These Inuit lived to tell this tale and wanted to help others. We created a touring Arctic exhibition under the auspices of something called the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, which was an organization founded specifically to aid survivors. And it opened in 2008 simultaneously in the Library and Archives Canada, seen here, as well as in an Arctic community, Arviat. Both openings worked out better than we could have hoped for, but I'll never forget that in Ottawa, when we had volunteers handing out free tickets to the exhibition in the downtown area leading up to the event, there were many people that rejected the free tickets on the street, saying things like, "I'm not interested in that history," or "that has nothing to do with me." It was shocking and not shocking all at once, because that the average non-native Canadian in 2010 could so blithely ignore what was perhaps the single most defining moment in our shared history, and one of the greatest proofs of colonial genocide in Canada. A history that is not ancient, but rather barely one generation removed. My father went to residential schools, my aunts and uncles. I don't know any Aboriginal people in Canada who don't have relatives that went to residential schools. We have many living survivors, and their children are still dealing with the aftermath of that violence. And yet this almost flippant denial vexed me, because here we have one of the most unequal democracies on the planet. We have people living in third world conditions within a very wealthy nation. We have Indigenous teenagers that have grown up never experiencing clean drinking water running out of a tap. We're less than 10% of the population. We're about 7% of the population, but we're more than 35% of the prison population. And we have more children in the foster care system today than at the height of the residential school system, which lasted about 100 years. This is the 2 openings. So here we have 90% of the population of Canada who have never learned any of this history at all. It's not that they necessarily don't care, but that they have had no exposure to this history in Canadian secondary schools. And many of them have also gone on to post-secondary education, where they also, they have to choose to learn about Indigenous history. It's not mandated. Every year, the students in my classes recite completely false stereotypes to me as facts. Clearly, much of the burden for fixing this lies in pedagogy, and contemporary art is not pedagogy, and we shouldn't treat it as such. However, we do know that it is a powerful communicative tool for building understanding, especially cross-culturally. So the idea for Decolonize Me arose when I was thinking, how do we get Canadians to engage in a difficult conversation when their nation state has a vested interest in keeping them ignorant of that truth? Can museums and other Western settler exhibition spaces, when occupied by Indigenous art and artists, be imagined as a kind of laboratory for imagining or modeling decolonization? Decolonize Me invited visitors to consider the ways in which they are implicated in our history and not separate from it, not as perpetrators or as victims, but as active participants with agency and a shared responsibility. The exhibition explored the issues and outcomes of colonization and neocolonialism, colonialism in the present, and how these processes impacted our individual and collective selves and identities, not only for Aboriginal peoples, but for all Canadians. The exhibition deliberately riffed on the title of Morgan Spurlock's film, Supersize Me, in which the filmmaker documented the deterioration of his physical and mental well-being while eating food from McDonald's, creating a scathing critique of capitalist domination and commodification. In a somewhat comparative context, Decolonize Me explores how the cumulative effects of consuming or being consumed by colonization through several centuries and the struggle to decolonize in recent decades have impacted contemporary identity politics, not just in terms of nations and communities, but how it actually impacts individuals within these societies. And yes, even by 2010, I was also bored with identity politics exhibitions. But I will say that I think that in this specific instance, and in many cases, and as we were looking at several of the presentations today, engaging with people and people's individual histories is a really still a very effective way to bring audiences together in an exhibition space and to convey something, in this case to a non-native audience, about the lived experience of Indigenous peoples. The exhibition featured 6 contemporary Aboriginal artists whose works challenge, interrogate, and reveal our shared colonial past and ongoing oppression using strategies like humor, juxtaposition, and narrative. Now, I don't have a lot of time to discuss all of the works, but I do want to talk about them. I am an art historian and a curator. And so I want to start with this work. I'm starting with this work for this particular audience. This is a work by Sunny Asu. It's called the Longing Series. Kwakwaka'wakw artist Sunny Asu plays with museological display archetypes, mounting found objects, these chunks of cedar that you see here, which are the discards from commercial logging industry in his region, in a contemporary art gallery environment using white pedestals, museum quality mounts, dramatic lighting, and photographic documentation to elevate what was these things that he found in a waste pile into fine art status. He began collecting these works and storing them in his studio while contemplating what to do with these very evocative pieces before ultimately deciding to allow the irregularity and the facelessness of these hunks of wood to be the strength of the work. His display also provokes the recognition that cedar is treasured by the Kwakwaka'wakw and other North Coast peoples. These lumber discards, left to rot in the rain, are not merely the worthless byproducts of conspicuous consumption. Cedar, not just the logs, but also the bark, the offcuts, everything considered waste by the non-native developer and the consumer, is valuable to the Kwakwaka'wakw as both a resource and a repository of cultural knowledge. Cedar has been and continues to be used to create everything from the practical to the sacred. It builds homes, it installs floors, it's made of baskets and mats and totem poles, but also ceremonial items and even regalia is woven out of cedar. By presenting these disposable masks in a gallery context, Asun manipulates the means through which the objects in the Western world acquire status and wealth, the found objects to be viewed as both art and artifact. In his subsequent triptych, the Artifacts of Authenticity series, Asu then takes these masks and put them into a variety of contexts with which you will be familiar. In these museological manipulations, Asu challenges us to reconsider waste and value from the Indigenous perspective, while causing us to question the extent to which an anthropological institution or an art museum maintains discursive authority over the classification, knowledge, and display of Indigenous art objects. In the Museum of Anthropology, and you can see here, this is not a digital manipulation. The piece is actually installed in the Museum of Anthropology. In this context, the mask gets to temporarily enjoy the company of its ancestors. In the Contemporary Art Gallery, it could relish in its brief status as a masterpiece. And in the gift shop, it perched among the native tchotchkes and wondered if someone would take it home. There's one of the books there says, "What am I looking at?" I think that Sunny rearranged the titles on this slide. Yet, like real Kwakwaka'wakw masks, blankets, rattles, and drums, in all these contexts, Asu's masks are still aestheticized and fetishized, divorced from authenticity and meaningfulness. The Longing series suggests that there has always been something lacking in the way that the objects of Indigenous manufacture have been collected, circulated, and displayed in Western institutions. Through his clever museological maneuverings in Longing, using juxtaposition and decontextualization, Asu's masks destabilize internalized notions about where Indigenous visual culture belongs and how it should be viewed, what it is worth, and what is worthless. It demands that we question how our ideas about Indigenous arts and culture might be shaped by the context in which we view it, and the ways that we value art, artifacts, and souvenirs. The fact that these found objects slip so easily between seemingly fixed categories of representation calls the categories themselves into question and ultimately finds them inadequate for understanding the complexity and totality of the Indigenous cultural object. Another work I want to talk about a little bit briefly is this piece by Métis Cree German multimedia artist Cheryl Larondelle. This is her ongoing net art project, Treaty Card, which, as an aside, I will say when we revived it for the exhibition, she had written it on such old code that she had to take it all apart and redo the whole project because it was one of the first net art projects in Canada, one of the major ones. Larondelle's tongue-in-cheek piece examines the history of colonization and Aboriginal identity through the lens of a government pass system. Treaty Card provides an opportunity for reflection on the system which imposed boundaries and regulated First Nations people, but not other Canadians. And so what she has done here in the exhibition is that you go in, you sit down on at this little desk, which is projected against the screen. You can see that there is a camera there and a laminator and a printer, and you actually go in and you make your own treaty card. And what she does is creates an opportunity for all people, not just Indigenous Canadians, but for everyone in Canada to make their own treaty card. So it's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek project where it's meant for people to acknowledge that, that it's not just Aboriginal people who have signed on to the treaties in Canada. It's all Canadian citizens. And so you can see here that, people have picked their own names for themselves. The one I see right now is Squishy Face in the middle. There's also Nat Attack and Music Maker and whatever people wanted. By creating a means for all Canadians to create a treaty card of their own or to modify their existing cards, if they are First Nations, Larondelle provides a counterpoint to the paternalistic identification system. The project of racial inclusion subverts the authority of governments to identify and exclude, while playfully inviting settler and new immigrant Canadians to recognize their own identity in relation to these roles and responsibilities to the land, the treaties, and the First Peoples. I think of this work as emblematic of a successful strategy for allowing visitors to unpack their own colonial baggage by inviting visitors into the museum to play, to interact with the art, and in the process to question, why have Indigenous peoples been the only ones to bear identification like this? Other works in the exhibition include multimedia artist and DJ Bear Witness of A Tribe Called Red's installation piece, Assimilate This, where he remixes Hollywood films and powwow footage in order to decontextualize Hollywood films. Here's a detail of that work using I'm sure some of you recognize this imagery. Another strategy that we used in order to try to decolonize the institution was to get things out of the gallery spaces exclusively and to have it kind of spill out over into the hallways and other areas. This is a work by Mi'kmaq artist Jordan Bennett, who did an installation piece and a performance in Newfoundland, and then we reinstalled it there. This is about the formation of the first First Nations band in Newfoundland, which has a long history that I won't get into right now. But basically, he did this piece, he did an installation and performance in Newfoundland and documented that process. And then we brought it into the gallery. But before it was brought into the gallery, it was covered in the local news in Newfoundland. And it actually engendered this very big conversation. It was a very short article that had like pages and pages in the comments section. And so as you can see in the background, I don't know if my next slide shows it, we printed out all the comments and did it like a wallpaper in the gallery, which was inviting people to think about, anonymity and online commentary and how racism gets stirred up in those forums. Other works in the exhibition include this another performative piece by Jordan Bennett where he made graffiti tags out of prime ministers' names and did this kind of installation, drawing a link between the first prime minister, who he gave the name John MacD, all the way up to Stephen Harper, who he renamed Chief Stevie. There were some good ones in there. This is a work by Barry Pottle, who's an Inuit photographer who also was looking at the history of the Eskimo Identification Series. These were tags. Nobody in Canada knows this history, but for a period of about 30 years, Inuit had to wear tags in order to come and go off of their communities as well, much like treaty cards and these the leather tags. So he interviewed people and did kind of an oral history and photographic project. You can see the works in long view. Nickitstill Norbert's stop motion animation. This was a piece where, it's really beautiful, I wish I had a clip, where on one side a braid is woven and unwoven, and on the other side one of these little Cupid dolls that we get in airports is bound and unbound. so the image, it becomes obscured, but then it is also sort of binded. You can see it in the exhibition view. These are beaded works that Nagitstil also did that look at the history and loss of the traditions passed down through residential schools. Some print works by Sunny Azu. This is really dated now because this is from, it riffs on that Gap Red ad from 2010. Some pieces did not, hold up as well over time. And then one of Sunny's great pieces, this is a quote from our then Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, who said, "We also have no history of colonialism, so we have all the things that people admire about the great powers, but none of the things that frighten or threaten them." And of course, this was 1 year after Harper had made a very public apology for residential schools. So less than a year after that, he was saying at the G20 summit that we had no history of colonization at all. When we created this exhibition, it was before international social justice movements like Occupy Wall Street, the Arab Spring, and Black Lives Matter. About 2 years into the exhibition tour, however, a cross-Canada movement began in December of 2012 by 4 women, 3 First Nations women and 1 non-Native ally, called Idle No More. It started in Western Canada and moved rapidly across the country. It was inspired in part by the fish broth hunger strike of Ottawapiskat Chief Teresa Spence in Ottawa. My pages are out of order. Ottawapiskat Chief Teresa Spence in Ottawa, who set up camp across from the Parliament Hill buildings, whose community had been in a state of emergency for decades. Coordinated via social media, a reaction to these alleged legislative abuses of Indigenous treaty rights by Stephen Harper and the Conservative federal government. The Idle No More movement took particular issue with an omnibus bill C-45, which threatened to permanently dispossess Indigenous peoples of their lands, while also eliminating protection for our most sacred of resources, fresh water. Canada had over 2.5 million protected lakes and over 9,000 or over 8,000 protected rivers. Canada now has only 97 protected lakes and 62 protected rivers, meaning that 99% of Canada's waterways are now unprotected. The popular movement included protests in the form of round dances in public places, as well as the blockades of railways. Like other contemporary social justice movements, its success was largely due in part to the decentralized organization and use of social media. The second wave of this movement drew attention to what is now one of our most pressing concerns. Got so many roundheads. They took over malls and outdoor spaces as well as indoor spaces. Is some of the social media campaign. The secondary wave of this movement drew attention to what is now among one of our most pressing concerns, which you may have heard of, and that is the need to hold a national inquiry on the ridiculously disproportionate numbers of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada. The RCMP released what many believe to be a very conservative number of 1,200, it's 1,000 murdered and 200 missing Indigenous women and girls just over the last 30 years since they started counting. Aboriginal women are only 4% of the population, but account for 11% of all missing and murdered and 17% of all murdered women. Again, social media was utilized to make a history that has been little known in the general public suddenly highly visible to Canadians. And this is the horrifying Am I Next campaign that was launched on social media and directed at specifically at Stephen Harper's office. People tweeting him again and again, am I next, am I next, am I next? I think perhaps the general public finally became exasperated with the policies of the Harper government and could no longer claim ignorance of Canada's treatments of Indigenous peoples. Most recently, in 2015, Maclean's magazine debuted a controversial title calling Winnipeg the city with the highest visible First Nations population, the country's most racist city. Soon after that, the Indian residential schools released their Truth and Reconciliation final report on the genocide of Canadian Aboriginal peoples. The cultural climate changed so dramatically between the period of the exhibition from 2011 to 2015. And regarding our exhibition, we noticed that it seemed to heighten the attendance, which I think is interesting because our touring venues were not major cities, but smaller cities that were in close conversation with, or neighbors to reserves that maybe they weren't in close conversation with. I think it called attention to some of the gaps in our exhibit and that we did not have anything included specifically on missing and murdered Indigenous women, for example. But it did pose a very interesting challenge for us in terms of programming for the exhibition as it toured. In Thunder Bay, we drew a huge audience to the curatorial tour. You can see it's somewhat surprising given the makeup of the people in the tour. We also had a really great discussion there. The gallery organized a community discussion with local Indigenous activists around racism, mining, and water in the area. We challenged all the other touring venues from that point onward to also engage their local Indigenous communities and to find out what areas of activism and interest are for the people there. And so I'll skip ahead a little bit, but I'll just note that one of the most exciting ones was that at the last venue, the gallery asked us that instead of bringing in 2 artists and a curator throughout the tour, as was common, instead they asked if we would decline visiting so that they could spend the entire programming budget to bring in many members of the local Saugeen First Nation, together with the local community in Owen Sound, to have a full-day workshop on cross-cultural training led by First Nations advocate and a council of elders. We couldn't think of a better way to spend the money. And so I'll just end with that note that, Decolonize Me addressed how these processes have impacted and continue to affect Canadian and Aboriginal peoples. And this new paradigm that the artists have articulated, I think, was fostered in part by was bolstered by the community outreach that we engaged in during the Idle No More movement. Thank you. Nakami.
Does this work? Does it work? Heather, Judith, what do you want us to do about questions? Pardon me? Just a couple. Yes. Well, I want to thank again the panelists. I was enthralled by all of your presentations. And so we'll just take a couple of questions from the audience. I know that we're tight on time. Are there no questions? Everybody's hungry.
We'll be there during lunch. You ask us then.
All right, well. Okay.
I was trying to give someone else a turn because I spoke last time, but I really enjoyed all of your presentations. I thought that they were great, and really in terms of the overall theme of what we just talked about in the last session and diversifying the curatorial profession, I think that all your presentations also talked about the ways that museums engage a diversity of themes and issues and histories, and in doing so provide opportunities for the visitorship to respond to that, and for people coming into the museum to perhaps see themselves in ways that they hadn't before. I was also thinking about the Decade Show, which is a show I think that came out in 1990 about kind of the multicultural arts era of the 80s. And in some ways, I think, we look back and we think, oh, is that dated? And what I felt like listening to you all, like it's not dated at all. That, again, these are not new issues. These are ongoing conversations. I just wanted to commend all of you on the work that you're doing. And I hope that your presentations are inspiring us to do better and do what you've been doing at your institutions.
Do you have a question?
It's always fantastic when you have an opportunity to engage with your ideas so directly in one exhibition. But then how do you come back to such important ideas in the rest of your programming? How can you sneak it in so that it remains relevant in terms of other histories you're telling? Have you had any experience doing that, or do you tend to take it on in just these large chunks?
Well, one of the things that I've come to an awareness is that we have to stop sneaking. We have to be far more bold in how we present diverse ideas, diverse works of art. And one of the confounding things for me is that for the last 10 years, since we've been in a new building, we've consistently had works from our permanent collection on view by African Americans, Asian Americans, Latino artists, and no one seems to care. And is it just a label text? What strategies does Tacoma Art Museum need to employ to make sure that our audience is engaging with these works? Because these works were entrusted to us in part because of the artist. And we are doing a disservice to the donor's intent. We're doing a disservice to the artist. We're doing a disservice to the community. So we're rethinking various strategies about that. And then don't be afraid of letting the community lead some of these conversations. One of the things I'm extraordinarily grateful for are sitting down at the table with members of the Action Collective and seeing their passion, their extraordinary knowledge. I mean, these young kids are much smarter than I'll ever be, and to let that work in your favor. There's a collective wisdom around that we should tap into more and more.
One thing I'm very fond of are these sort of micro interventions in the permanent collection gallery, because I think in most of our institutions for exhibitions of any scale, the minute you utter the word exhibition, that implies something else, and you have to put it through a mechanism and that involves all the other constituent departments, and it becomes a kind of a larger beast. But I'm a big fan of these kind of mini exhibitions that are maybe as few, 3 to 5 works in a permanent collection gallery, where you don't have to put it through that mechanism, so you can respond more quickly. So I recreated part of the Walter White anti-lynching exhibition in the American Gallery, among the permanent collection, and I have a Isaac Scott Hathaway show up right now that consists of one case that's filled with his sculpture and his coin designs, and the important Black sculptor and ceramicist. So that's one strategy that is, I think, helpful to me anyway.
And I'll just add to that at the Block Museum, we have a document which we call our through lines that names the ways that we manifest our mission to represent our art across time, place, culture, and media. And we make sure that we're talking to each other about how often we're seeing those through lines. And we look at our programming, not just in terms of exhibitions, but also engagement and our film program and all sorts of ways. And we make sure that it's iterative. So it's not just a kind of one-shot deal. It's not enough to just, do a one before Northwestern and then never return to that topic again. And is there another question? And this might be our last one.
I promise I'll be brief. Shoshana Resnikoff from the Peabody Essex Museum. I really enjoyed all of you guys' presentations, but I was especially interested from Graham and Kelly. When you're presenting these sorts of projects, obviously it's important to get internal buy-in, but that buy-in isn't just from senior administrators, it's also from committed community members. I'm speaking specifically of docents, who are always wonderful partners and participants, but sometimes come with their own baggage and their own expectations. And I'm wondering if you've had any experience working on this project and sort of how you get their buy-in as well.
That was such a key portion, to this show, because the docents at BMA were really long. Yeah, they were really nervous. And so what we did is we kind of called them together, had this meeting, and I kind of had my come to Jesus talk with them. And I said, this is what I am here for. You engage, because the thing was we don't really own this experience, so we can't talk about it. And my response was well, you weren't alive in 14th century Italy either, and you can own that response. And so I said, utilize me. So I would create bibliographies for them of works they could read. And then afterward, it became this where I'm Facebook friends with so many of them now. I sent the Beyonce Lemonade syllabus, to them. But it was really engaging them and our security staff, and kind of adding them both, to the conversation and saying, this is something that we all have to talk about. It can't just be the curators.
And I'll just add to that, we were very fortunate that concurrent with this exhibition, we had the show that Stephanie Meyer-Height organized that traveled around the country of the Hale Woodruff murals from Talladega. And so we put together a community group for that to help us promote the show and talk about ways most best to promote the show. And so that gave us the platform to also talk to them concurrently about Black Like Who. So it was the timing was advantageous also for us.
Well, one more time, I want to thank the panelists. You were all really great. And thanks to all of you for your attention.